we spent tens of thousands of dollars on our son's health. We've lost everything we own twice over in terms of having to get rid of things. So just being a bit more proactive and aware about mold and what it can do to the home and your health can go a long way to saving you those big costly expenses.
Hello and welcome to the Building Psychology Potty, where we talk about better buildings to live and breathe in. It is becoming more widely understood that mold in our homes can have a serious impact on health and that some people are far more sensitive to it than others. My guest today knows this all too well. When her son began developing unexplained tics and other symptoms, Tracy Seymour spent 2 long years and a lot of money searching for answers. And the root cause turned out to be hidden mold. Rather than stopping there, Tracy turned that experience into her mission. She founded Break the Mould Inspections, helping families across Sydney and surrounding areas identify and address mold issues in their homes. I first met Tracy through the advanced mold testing course we're both completing at the Australian College of Environmental Studies as part of the Advanced Diploma in Building Biology. We share that same curiosity and passion for understanding how buildings impact health. And today we're diving into exactly that: mold, health, and what to do if this becomes a problem in your own home. Welcome, Tracy.
Hi, Jess. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So let's dive into what happened with your son. Could you tell us a bit about the symptoms he started to experience and how you worked out what was causing it?
Yeah, big question, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so my son was 5 years old at the time. For lack of a better word, completely normal, no issues, no health-related issues. And we noticed that quite literally what felt like overnight, he developed neurological tics. So it started with some hard eye blinking. It was quite repetitive. It was happening sort of, every few minutes. It then progressed to eye rolling, which then progressed to sort of more of a neck turn and eye roll. So these tics obviously were quite confronting as a mum, sort of seeing these things happen. I took him to the GP, and unfortunately the GP said, oh yeah, he's developed a motor tic. Just ignore it. And if it's still there in 12 months, he's probably got Tourette's. And I think I just went numb and almost had a bit of an out of body experience thinking, what? Like, this just doesn't seem right. But I left the office and sort of went home and talked to my husband, and it just wasn't sitting right with me. I couldn't just ignore that my son was ticking like a clock. And so, I started the process of investigation, and look, this really was quite a long journey to get to the point of connecting the dots to mold. And I guess that's why I, am so passionate about it and working with families and helping to educate them about mold and what it can do to the body, so that hopefully someone doesn't have to go through the years and financial expense that we had to, in trying to get our son diagnosed. So apart from the hard eye blinking and the motor tics, which over the years they did transition. Sometimes they were a whistle. Sometimes they might have been a repetitive motion like licking of an elbow or something quite random. Really high frequency urination. Sometimes every 30 to 60 seconds he might need to go. We went to endless amounts of specialists who, sort of threw everything at us, like put him on ADHD medication or diabetes medication, epilepsy medication, all these things which to me just did not sit right. I felt like I was just being given a Band-Aid solution to something which, as I know now, if we had have gone down that route and given him those things, not only would we have never addressed the root cause of what was causing the reaction in his body, but he would have had all these other side effects as well from the medications that he was not supposed to be on. Really amazingly, one day in sheer desperation, I put out on a local Facebook group mums page to ask if anyone had had similar issues with their child. And one beautiful mum reached out and said, look, I'm on my way to do school drop-off, but I'll private message you. And she sort of alerted me to an amazing doctor, pediatrician, who she had worked with for her child. And I called the office, and sadly, it was a 10-month wait to get in. And I remember just feeling so discouraged and desperate, and I was crying of a nighttime because, to see your child going through this, it wasn't just the tics, it was anxiety and OCD. So things that we thought might have been a bit cute at first, we quickly realized this actually is not. It's actually something going wrong with his brain. He was doing repetitive counting and would always have to touch smooth surfaces. If he brushed past something, he'd have to touch it again and go back. So all these things, which were just little alarm bells and things putting together to go, this is not quite right. As a mum, sort of desperate to find an answer, I spent every day and every night till all hours, just sort of trolling through Google and Instagram and everything I could possibly try and absorb to find the answer. And then it was just something quite random that I came across that suggested the possibility of mold. Now, mold wasn't something that I was very aware of. It wasn't something that I ever thought was dangerous. I grew up in that sort of era of, I'll just bleach it and it'll be fine. So it wasn't something that I was necessarily aware of, the potential health issues. I raised it with our pediatrician. She said, well, do you have mold in the home? And I said, well, yes. I mean, there was a leak in our ceiling when there was some really heavy rains about 3 years ago in Sydney. And the solution at the time was to have it cleaned. Obviously, the repair work where the leak had come in, it actually took a lot longer than what we had expected. There was lots of quotes coming through. But essentially, we did not clean it, or the company we got to do didn't clean it. What they did was bleach it. So I guess from an aesthetics, it looked better, but we didn't know any better. And the mold was still very entrenched into that ceiling substrate. And consequently, all the mycotoxins and mold and things just proliferating throughout our home. And that's what he was reacting to. Now, our amazing doctor was a pediatrician. She was able to run some mycotoxin tests, and, the connection there was the type of mold that was in our home after we got a mold test done. Directly correlated with the type of mycotoxins that was in his body. And I think the rough guideline of what's normal was 7.5 and below for this particular mycotoxin. And I think his was at like 366.
Oh,
So
okay.
completely off the charts. We'd gone through the process of, sort of, goodness, so many things, but testing to see what was in his body, what's being impacted, how much has mold impacted his immune system, his neurological system, his liver, so many different things and so many ways that mold had just really caused complete havoc in his body. And I guess that's sort of what brought me to becoming a mold inspector and wanting to help somebody identify that stuff a lot quicker than what we were able to do, or even, allowing people to be educated on a topic that they can jump onto and make sure it doesn't become a problem for them in their homes. You don't have to wait until you've got a child who's really, really sick. You can sort of action mold as soon as you know that it's a problem within the home. So yeah, I think that's some of the symptoms that we experienced from mold and how we went about sort of addressing those.
To say the Tourette's type tics is not a symptom that I've heard of before. That's a new one, and quite a distressing one as a parent to watch these uncontrollable tics. I can't imagine. Respiratory issues and rashes is one thing, but to think that it's affecting your child's brain in such a severe way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Goodness.
it's causing inflammation, so that inflammation, and it's also mold wreaks havoc on the gut. So it's
Mm.
destroying the gut. It's creating that permeability, those leaky gut
Mhm.
issues. And therefore, when you get that cross between the blood-brain barrier, you get inflammation. And
Yep.
when the brain's inflamed, that's when you're having these sort of OCD, you're having neurological tics, you're having anxiety, those sorts of symptoms.
Emotional responses too, like that anxiety you were talking about.
Completely.
Yeah. So it took you 2 years to come to these conclusions. Your son is much better now?
Yeah, look, we still deal with some of the, I guess, I want to say side effects, I guess some of the issues that mold did to his body. Unfortunately, our story goes a little bit deeper than that, and I'm not sure how much time you got for time for today, but we identified the mold and we moved out of mold and we moved into a new home. We stretched ourselves financially to go into a home that we thought was, a beautiful new renovated home. And unfortunately, we very quickly found out that that was not the case. It wasn't until I started studying to become a mold inspector or doing building biology that I sort of got a little bit more education on how to go about things. We had a mold inspector come out to the house when we moved into this new home, and her samples came back to say that, everything was clear on an air sample. Unfortunately, we had some toxic mold growing between our kitchen cabinetry and the walls, and also behind the dishwasher. Now, unfortunately, she didn't go to the extent of pulling out the dishwashers and things like that. And I guess that's something that I'm quite pedantic about now, is that I try not to leave any stone unturned,
Mhm.
because I was sitting there thinking, why on earth is our son not getting better? We are doing everything we're supposed to. We've changed the diet. We've got the supplementations. We've moved him out of mold, or so we thought, but he was still so sick. And I guess for us, because that process was completely prolonged, because we thought we'd gotten out of mold and we hadn't, he was still being exposed. His toxic cup was still just getting overflown. And for us, I think, it's been a long journey, because we had to go through the process of misdiagnosis and thinking we were in a safe house and out of mold. And it wasn't until we moved to our next house that we truly got out of mold. And thankfully, by this time, I was a qualified mold inspector. So I was able to go to town on this property and, sort of make sure that we are 100%, free from toxigenic molds.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of, this is actually a question I've got further down my list about moving house, because there'd be a lot of people in your position who need to get out of houses that are making them sick. But how do they
Yeah.
know that they're not doing what you did, moving into a new moldy house? And I know that you've had experience with real estate agents doing things to kind of, yeah, it's fine, this is all good, kind of, oh, don't want to say tricking people, but they have ways of getting around mold issues in homes that they're
Yeah.
trying to sell or rent out. So could you tell us a bit about what
Sure.
people can
Yeah. I
do?
mean, look, there's definitely things that you can do when you're looking for a new property if you think that mold or moisture might be an issue or you're concerned about it, both
Hmm.
when renting and purchasing. The truth is that the both are not without their limitations, but you can definitely help to quickly rule out some properties, even just by looking online. If you're purchasing a property, so as part of your due diligence and, the building and pest inspections and things that you're going to request anyway, you can book a mold and moisture assessment if the vendor's going to allow you to do that. Now, bearing in mind, it will take the inspector quite a number of hours. But, sort of my thought process on that, if they've got nothing to hide and, they want to sell the house, then it should be acceptable for you to book a mold and moisture inspection. And in that instance, we're able to use things like your thermal imaging cameras, moisture meters, boroscope cameras where possible, high-powered torches. And these tools can really help to detect the hidden mold or some, temperature anomalies that might indicate that there's mold behind the walls, under the floors, or in the ceiling. We can do some testing and things like that as well. But it's one of those things that when people are trying to sell a property, you're normally looking at it in its best light. It's just been
Mm.
freshly painted,
Mhm.
everything's opened up and breezy, they've got beautiful candles going, that sort of thing. So it's about trying to identify the things that are the telltale signs that might not be obvious to most people. So we're looking for things like, and you can do this yourself, go into a property and have a look for cracking or bubbling of paint, water staining. You're having a look at things like, where is the property positioned on the land? Is it at the bottom of a hill where all that moisture during heavy rain is just going to come in and flood that property? You're looking at, is there signs of water pooling around the outside of the building? Can you see that it's like sloshy in some areas, or that you can see that moisture has risen up around the foundation? Stick your head in if there's a subfloor. Give it a smell. Does it stink under there? There's lots of different things that you can do. And I mean, it is easier in a pre-purchase inspection versus, say, a rental, especially in Sydney. Rental market is crazy. And you're going to turn up and you've probably got about 15 minutes and there's probably 20 to 50 other people all looking at that same property. So I suggest looking for those red flags first. Have a look online. You can do a little bit of research yourself to see, is it in a flood zone? Has there been floods in the past? Look at the neighboring properties. Are they up higher, and in heavy rain, is that water going to come down into the property? Look at the drainage around the outside. Take a high-powered torch with you. Shine it perpendicular on any sort of cupboards and surfaces. If the tenant's belongings have mold on them, yes, they're going to take that out, but those mycotoxins and mold spores are circulating within that property. So getting that torch and sort of shining it around, you can do that fairly quickly yourself. And again, looking for things like the exhaust fans in the bathrooms and the laundries, for example. Just get a little piece of toilet paper and hold it up to the exhaust fan and see, is it actually sucking up? Does it
Mm.
seem like it's actually going to be able to remove some of that moisture when you're using that bathroom, and looking for signs of condensation, staining? You can sometimes see moisture stains on the ceiling and things like that. So lots and lots of different things that you can do yourself. I just always say to people, if you're looking for a property, and it's a rental and you've got like a short amount of time, you just want to try and do as much as you possibly can before you even get there. Drive past the property and have a look, sort of have a look at the land, have a look at what you can see around you. Do you have a creek right next to you? All these sorts of things that you can actually look for yourself. Has the property got a really good hatch? Does it have good sort of eaves covering over the windows? Is there window protection? Does the gutters and things look full and overflowing, or do they look like they're, sort of functioning really well? So trying not to, when both purchasing and renting, trying not to be swayed by the aesthetics, trying to look more at the functionality of the property and the structural integrity of the property, I think is probably my biggest recommendation.
That's a very comprehensive list of things to look for. Really awesome advice. Thank you. So now let's move on to your official mold inspections. What's the typical process when you go into a house and what are you looking for?
Yeah, look, I mean, I told you earlier, I got into this industry because I want to help families. So even though I do some commercial work and some sort of other mold inspections for people, my passion is for helping families to connect the dots from health issues and things like that. So when any client calls me, one of the first questions that I ask them is, what's been the trigger? Why are you looking to get a mold inspection? And is it because they've got lots of visible mold and they want to know where it's coming from or how to remove it? Or is it because they have health issues and they, sort of got no idea why and they're just trying to connect the dots somehow? So that's really important. The process obviously is, going through all of the building history and what the property is made of, where it's located, etc. That's the fundamental stuff that you do at the start to get a good history on the property. Have they had furniture from a previously water damaged building that they're bringing into this space that could have contaminated it? Is there a history of leaks from a dishwasher, a washing machine, bathroom, etc.? All of those sorts of structural and functional fundamental things, that's sort of a given at the start. But when I go into a property, it's about looking for the things that people don't necessarily see with the naked eye, because I know personally when things are overlooked, that can keep people sick for a long period of time. And I've seen some very random situations. A whole family, for example, had no idea that their teenage son had built a false room within the house. So they basically built themselves a little storage area within the house when the family went away, and it provided a fake wall. Growing in behind that was all sorts of nasties, and they had no idea. So I think, I definitely have seen a lot when it comes to the process. I'm trying to find what people aren't seeing. I'm getting there, which is not my favorite thing to do, but getting in under the subfloors and having a look with the torch to see, is there mold on the underside of those subfloors that's coming up into the bedrooms, for example. I'm pulling out the dishwashers, I'm getting up into the attics and seeing, I literally had one lady who had no idea that in her attic space, there was a complete setup with a little light on up there and someone had a painting easel and everything going on up there. Quite creepy. But people don't know so much about what's going on in their homes. And I think that's probably one of the most fascinating things. And if I can identify those things for them, it goes a little bit beyond just finding the mold. It's like finding obscure things as well. And I think that's part of the fun of the process, finding those things that people don't know are happening within their home and helping them to then come up with a plan for remediation and then to be able to help them to actually finally fix their home to help them to heal from mold.
Yeah, wow. So that house with the easel in the roof, this is from the previous owner and they just left it there.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
Was somebody
They
crawling
had
into
no
the roof
idea
with
when
at
I
night
went
and
down and I
painting?
said, "What's going on with the easel, the painting easel and the little light upstairs?" And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You don't know that that's up there and the light is on and it's all set up?"
Oh
She
my
goes,
goodness.
"No."
Oh my
Rang her
goodness.
husband and he had no idea either. Yeah, creepy, but people
Oh,
have
it's
no
not
idea
possums in the
sometimes what's
roof.
going on in and around their home, which I just find completely fascinating.
Yeah, they thought it was possums, but actually it's a lady doing some painting.
Some painting. Yeah, who
Oh,
knows? But
wow.
yeah, crazy.
That's cool. So when you're actually looking for mold in a home, how do you find it?
I mean, sometimes you can't find it in the sense that it's not visible.
Hmm.
You've got to find it through the testing, through either air samples or tape samples, for example. Quite often I find that an air sample is great for quantifying what's going on in the air at that time and giving our clients, sort of an indication of the levels of contamination that are currently at the time of testing going through the air. But sometimes it's really good to be able to do a tape sample, say, for example, on the top of a ceiling fan or on the top of a bookshelf, for example. And I find those sorts of things good when it comes to, say, for example, a pre-purchase inspection where the owner or the vendor or the real estate may have opened everything up and made it all quite diluted in terms of the air sample. And I find if I can just put a tape sample somewhere that's high up and maybe wasn't expected to be sampled, I can get a lot of information from that tape sample. And it's really good for helping to identify the condition of something as well, because it's a NADA accredited lab that we use and it's able to say condition 1, 2, or 3, which helps me and my clients to work out what they need to do in terms of remediation of their property and their belongings.
Mhm.
I find sometimes we have visible mold in a section of the home and the client just wants to know what type of mold it is. And I find that really helpful just to be able to do what we call a loud sample. And that's where we put the tape directly onto that mold and it will tell us, what type of mold is present. And that can help with other things in terms of identifying, is this a prolonged moisture issue? Is this just some humidity or condensation? So there's lots of information that we can get from the air samples and the tape samples as well.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to raise there. So condition 1, 2, and 3, could you quickly just tell the listeners what that means?
Yeah, sure. So condition 1 is your normal fungal ecology. Mold is everywhere. Everywhere has mold, but everywhere doesn't have toxigenic water damage building molds. So condition 1, normal fungal ecology, is when we take an air sample or a tape sample and you might have a little bit of mold on there. And that's fine. It's within the limits of what is normal. Condition 2 is where a large percentage of the tape or the air sample has been contaminated or is showing contamination. And it's normally from a nearby active mold source that you can see. So I might do a tape sample on a bed head, for example. I can't see any visible mold there, but it's being contaminated by the large scale visible mold that might be, say, in the other room, for example. So that's your condition 1 and 2. And condition 3 is where you see the visible mold.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And a loud sample. You mentioned a loud sample. So there's a quiet
Yep.
sample and a loud sample. Could you tell the listeners what that means, please?
Sure. So a loud sample is quite literally where we put the tape straight onto the mold. We know it's there. It's not hidden. It's there. And it's just going to help us to identify, sort of the type of fungi that's present. And then a quiet sample is where it doesn't look like there's anything suspicious there, but we're going to pick up what's maybe invisible or what's hidden in the dust on the sample. And that can help us to sort of sometimes find and identify that there's mold within the premises that's not maybe so visible, as in it's not shining nice and loudly on the wall.
Yep, yep. So you wouldn't typically test a loud sample because
Not
you can
really.
see it. So you don't need to test for it, right?
Yep.
So
It's
you
generally
typically
only
do.
if you're trying to, sort of quantify some data. For
Yeah.
example, like as I said before, some of my clients have asked me to do it because they just want to know. They want to know what kind of mold it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd want to know because,
Yeah.
there's 5 main types of mold, and there's the Aspergillus penicillium, which is the most common type of mold found, and then there's
Yeah.
the other types that indicate that there's been longer term water damage issue. So what are those types?
Yeah. Yeah. So, Aspergillus, I'm based in Sydney and Aspergillus is pretty much the most common and I guess most detrimental in many ways because it goes unseen quite often. People don't know that their belongings are covered in Aspergillus until you sort of shine the torch perpendicular onto it. But then I'm also looking at things like Cotomium, Stachybotrys. These are your tertiary colonizers. So these are the ones that need a lot more moisture to be able to create mold and a problem. So Aspergillus is like what we call the first on the scene. It only needs a little bit of moisture. It only needs dust, to be able to form and colonize. Humidity is just enough for Aspergillus. And that's why it's so bad in Sydney and say the Central Coast, for example, because it's so humid here. But then when you're talking about like your Cotomians and your Stachybotrys, they're the ones where it's got to have a lot of moisture to be able to proliferate. So you're talking about like a leak or constant water going into a substrate, for example, We're looking for aspergillus, we're looking for your stachybotrys, we're looking for your cotomium. And then you've got your non-toxigenic but highly allergenic mold, which is cladosporium. And that's really helpful to identify because that's something that I see really, really commonly because people have too much condensation within the home or they're not heating the rooms effectively in winter and they're getting condensation on the windows and then it's creating mold in the dust and also on, say, like the wooden window frame, for example. So it's really important, I think, to be able to identify the species or the genre of mold that is present in a home because it paints a picture about what's going on inside the
Yep.
home.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Thank you for explaining that. Mold is not like it's not all the same. It actually tells you a story, which is, that's really cool when you can identify what's going on in your home. And do those molds have different levels of mycotoxins that they emit or expel?
Yeah, I mean, they do. For example, I was saying to you before, my son's levels were enormous with one, which was ochratoxin A, and that, you know, each mold you can easily Google and have a look, and you can see, what type of mycotoxins are produced by what type of mold genre as well,
Uh-huh.
and then. There's lots of data out there as well that shows you what impact those mycotoxins can have on the body. Is it liver function? Is it neurological? Is it immune suppression? All those sorts of things. It's actually quite fascinating when you get into it to understand what you've got in your home. And this is what I help my clients with quite often is let's do the mold sampling. Let's identify what type of molds and what quantity, like what level of contamination. And then I help them with, connecting with functional medicine practitioners who are able to then do some of these tests where they, test their bodies for what type of mycotoxins and things are actually circulating in their system. And then with the functional medicine practitioner, they're able to actually then do a very personalized protocol for detoxing and getting rid of the mold out of their system and those mycotoxins out of their system.
That's fascinating. I might try and get together some resources on those different types of mycotoxins and put them in the show notes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's talk about cleaning versus remediation because
Mm.
everyone seems to get this wrong. There's a lot of confusion around how to actually effectively get rid of mold. So, how do we know when a simple clean is going to be sufficient or when remediation
Yeah.
is necessary?
Yeah, I think when it comes to dealing with mold, that distinction between cleaning and remediation is actually quite critical. Cleaning is about surface level mold removal. So it's effective for small, localized mold growth on your non porous surfaces. So think glass, think metal, that sort of thing. When you're talking about remediation, it's a whole different ballgame. You're talking about porous items and the need for either discarding those items or professional remediation. So if you're talking about, say, the IICRC S5 standard, that emphasizes that mold needs to be removed. So we're not trying to kill mold, we're trying to remove it. And I think that's one thing that's really important for people to get their heads around is, all these products that are out there that says, kills mold. We don't want to kill mold. We actually want to physically remove it from the property. When you're talking about porous items, and that can be wood, it can be your drywall and your ceiling, mold has really deep roots. So if you're killing or removing the surface mold, you're not actually addressing the problem. So those mold roots go really, really deep into those substrates. And then what you'll find is people say, oh, we cleaned it, we removed it. And then it comes back again because it can just sit there waiting for the right conditions again, whether that's too much humidity, too much dust, a little bit of a moisture leak again. That, sort of differentiation between what you can clean and what needs to be remediated is really important. I think, in terms of remediation, you're also looking at things like containment. So when you're stripping out, let's say, carpets or drywall, whatever that might be, you've really got to think about the containment as well, because you don't want those spores and everything to just go flying about when you're ripping these products out. So it's really important when you're talking about remediating mold that you're looking at negative air pressure for your air scrubbers and things like that. You're looking at ways to make sure that you contain that contamination to that particular area and that room. And that's why remediation, sort of goes so much deeper than just cleaning of mold and what can be cleaned and what can't. And I
Mhm.
think, moisture control is a big one when it comes to remediation, because if you don't fix the source of the moisture, you're just going to have it come back again anyway. So remediation is so much more detailed than cleaning, and remediation is a lot more expensive for people. And I think it's one of those things that, when you talk about the potential implications of mold, you know, the costs can just blow out because it does do so much damage, and there's so much more than just sort of wiping something clean or wiping it off. And if you don't address it properly, it can become a bigger problem, not just to the structure of the building, but to your health as well.
So the primary difference between if you can clean something and if you need to remediate it is if it's porous or non-porous.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Would that be correct?
Yeah,
So
definitely.
any furniture that's porous, if you've had a mold issue, probably needs to go. Clothing.
As a general rule of thumb, I sort of say, in most instances, like some things you can go to professional remediators and try to have cleaned, but as a general rule of thumb, if it can't go in the washing machine, it's got to go.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So if you have a homeowner that does have a mold, damp, moisture, mold affected property, what is the
Yep.
most practical steps they can take before they bring in a professional like yourself?
Look, I mean, I think if you're dealing with mold, you know that you've got mold. The number one thing would be to control the humidity. Mold can't exist without moisture. So thinking about, the levels of the levels of moisture that you've got happening within the home with humidity, especially in somewhere like Sydney in the Central Coast, you're going to have a lot of days where you're above 90% humidity. It's crazy. So using things like a dehumidifier, making sure that you've got effective extractor fans in the bathrooms, laundry, kitchen, opening up your spaces daily. I mean, first thing I do most mornings is open my whole house up and just let that cross ventilation air out the house and exchange that sort of stale air and bring in some nice, clean, fresh air. And then we've got an air purifier going, sort of when the house is closed up. So I think, controlling humidity, thinking about your cooking, bathing, breathing, anything that you're doing to create more moisture in the home, it puts more pressure on the home and raises the risk for mold. So drying laundry inside the house, that sort of stuff, like I'd recommend not doing that. So just thinking about how much moisture you're putting into the house, addressing any obvious moisture issues. If you've got a leak, if you're seeing water staining somewhere, not leaving it, addressing it really quickly. Houses are always going to have problems. There's always going to be leaks or potential for issues, but if you address them quickly, it can just be a small problem that can get fixed rather than it becoming a really big problem that contaminates your whole house or, structurally undermines the integrity of the building. So I would definitely say, sort of addressing issues quickly. Things like if you see your gutters overflowing, make sure that you're addressing that, getting out there quickly and just being preventative rather than reactive.
Mhm.
And ventilation, I mean, I sort of touched on it with regards to the extractor fans and opening the house up. But I think ventilation is one of those things that it's so simple and so easy. I go to so many people's houses and they'll say, oh, that window doesn't open, or we've kept this room closed because it's a problem. It's like, you're just closing it up. You're just giving it the mold more of what it needs. A nice, warm, moist place with, no fresh air.
It's time for a quick sponsor shout out. Today's episode of the Building Sciology Potty is proudly brought to you by our amazing sponsors, Enduro Builders and Climasure. A huge thank you to these incredible businesses for supporting the podcast and helping us spread the word about better buildings to live and breathe in. Your support makes this podcast possible. Please head over to their websites and follow their social pages. And in Sydney, or in more humid areas north of Australia and in the tropical zones of the world, wouldn't opening up the windows introduce more moisture into your house?
So it depends. You've really got to, there's some, you can get yourselves little thermometers and moisture meters and things like that to, sort of take a gauge on that. I know for my dehumidifier, it's got a setting on it as well, and it can help me to control the level of humidity. That's why, like for me, for example, first thing early in the morning is the best time to open everything up because that humidity hasn't risen. I definitely don't do it when it's raining or if it's, sort of high levels of humidity. But there's some, fairly cheap products on the market that can help you to keep a monitor on what level of humidity is in your home. You definitely don't want to open everything up, if it's super hot and humid outside. But at the same time, there's periods a day where it won't be, and you can open it up and exchange that air. But being on top of that, making sure you're using dehumidifiers on those hot and humid days, sometimes running your air cons on dry mode, that sort of thing can really help.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Now, speaking of keeping houses closed up, you have had personal experience with this with your rental property. Tell us
Uh-huh.
what happened.
Yeah, bit of a kick in the guts. So we have my husband and I have a holiday home that we rent out through Airbnb. We hadn't actually been up there for a couple of years. It's in northern New South Wales. And obviously the last time I was up there, I was definitely not mold inspector. So I decided to book a trip with some girlfriends and, have a great time away up there. Unfortunately, that trip turned bad very quickly because when we opened it up, immediately that smell, that musty, moldy smell that I know so well was just a slap in the face. And I just knew. And everything changed in an instant from me. My whole vibe and mode completely changed. And I went into mold inspector mode. And I spent my week up there basically looking over every square inch of the property. Unfortunately, it gets really hot and humid up there. It's a holiday home that gets let out Friday to Sunday most of the time, which means it's closed up, you know, for a good portion of the week. We did have a property manager who was managing it, but obviously wasn't managing it properly, and wasn't, making sure that it was aired out appropriately and ventilated and didn't let us know that there was a problem. So humidity and dust control up in that property was an issue. So we have now gone into recovery mode, which is not fun. It is expensive. It is not just the remediation works that need doing, but as it's a holiday rental, I can't in good faith rent this property out to people knowing that it has mold. So for us, we've had to cancel our forward bookings for a period of time, which, that's a massive expense. Those bookings pay the mortgage on that property. So, there's one level of the cost and expense for that. And then, we're having to rip out all the carpets. We're having to replace with hardwood floors. We have to engage with a mold remediation company to come and, remediate our property properly, in terms of things like containment and things like that I was talking about earlier and how important it is. But unfortunately, because the levels of mold within the house that I was able to identify and even just see visually with the torch, it just means that pretty much everything's got to go from a remediation point of view, like we are talking about before, couches, mattresses, linens, that sort of stuff. It's all got to go. So again, that's another level of expense. We are obviously in the process, because this was only just recently, we're in the process of all of this and organizing trades and services and looking at how do we now, moving forward, make sure that our property is better ventilated, making sure that we have humidity controls in place. And I asked for your advice the other day, Jess, on, some software and things like that, and some products that are able to help me from down in Sydney to be able to check in on the property and be able to switch things on remotely to be able to help, which I think is going to be a big benefit as well. So that, as well as a new property manager who's able to manage the property properly for us and keep an eye on these things. But it just goes to show that, we don't have leaks really. I mean, there was one condensation issue in the air conditioning. Actually, that's probably a really good point. When you're on holidays and the property owner or the hotel or whoever asks you to close the doors when you've got the air conditioning on, please do so, because what happens is you've got this property which is opened up, which is great. It's got all this fresh air coming through potentially, but you've got the air conditioning running and the condensation that builds up on the ductwork sort of all forms. If you can imagine like a bottle of Coke on a hot summer's day and you take it outside and suddenly you get all that condensation on the outside. That's exactly what happens to the ductwork in the air conditioning, which then drips down onto the ceiling. So we do have a little bit of an issue with that, which means we're going to have to fix that. But it is also, it's one of those things that I ask people to be mindful of people's properties and, sort of when you're going into these spaces, how you're looking after these homes so that they can be safe for the next person coming in and not cost a bomb to fix. But, majority of our issues at that property is humidity. So it's about, again, that ventilation. It's about controlling the humidity within the home, and making sure that things are kept dust free to ensure that the mold doesn't have a really fast food, easy, quick source to feed on.
Yeah. And none of that's covered by your insurance, is it?
Not
None
a
of that
thing.
remediation.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. I think that's one thing that's, a big thing with mold. People have no idea that their insurances most likely won't cover mold,
Yeah,
and it's expensive. Mold remediation is expensive.
fittingly so. Not only are you
Yeah.
dealing with all the health stuff like with your son, but then the
Yeah, absolutely.
life
I mean,
destroying for
not
some
only from a
people.
building perspective and a belongings perspective, from a health perspective, I mean, we spent tens of thousands of dollars on our son's health with
Mm,
regards to, specialist appointments, supplementation, testing. Some of these testings, each time we do them, they're $600.
yep,
And we've done so many over the
yep.
years. So it's one of those things that adds up really, really quickly, and it takes its toll financially when you have to. We've lost everything we own twice over
Mhm.
in terms of having to get rid of things. So that's expensive. Moving costs are expensive. The actual remediation's expensive. So just being a bit more proactive and aware about mold and what it can do to the home and your health, can go a long way to saving you those big costly expenses.
Absolutely. Just getting educated on how this can
Yeah.
even be. Yeah.
Mm.
You must have tested dozens to hundreds of homes by now. Have you got one case study that stands out apart from the lady with the easel in the attic?
Look, I mean, I wouldn't like to say I've seen it all because that's just going to throw some other weird and wacky things at me to jinx me. But I've seen a lot. I've definitely seen a lot. I think, when you talk about like a case study that really stands out, it's actually my own. It's actually
Mhm.
my own, and knowing that how dangerous mold can be for susceptible people. I feel like I go into people's homes regularly, and it's quite often the wife who is concerned that there's mold issues causing problems in their home, but the husband and maybe some of the other people in the home aren't having those experiences, and maybe it's not believed. So they might be a little bit more reluctant to sort of have the mold and moisture test done. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I would say, people are susceptible in all different levels. 1 in 4 people can't detox properly the same way from mold as the rest of the home. So it makes complete sense that there would be a home of 4 and one person suffering and others aren't. So I guess the case study, there's not one case study that really stands out, but I would say in my situation with my son, he was the only one affected. He was the only one having these like severe issues. We were all living in the same amount of mold, but only one person was sort of having, significant health issues. So I would say, if someone in the household is having some sort of issues, believe them. And
Mm.
if someone's talking about mold toxicity and things, because quite often, I can go on for days about mold and its impact on the body and things like that. And quite often, some people look at you like you're wearing your tin hat and a bit crazy. So I would say, for some of my clients who, they knew something was not right, and they struggled with either convincing family members and things to believe them or to even get the testing and things done, be open to it, because not everybody is affected the same way. And there are things that are impacting people in their home and in their environment that aren't going to impact everybody, but it's very real for the people who are.
Absolutely. And then once you go down the route of testing, for in your son's case, especially, the numbers showed what was going on. So it wasn't just anecdotal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting. As I said, my primary love is working with families and things who have got health issues. I've seen kids with, debilitating conditions and, things like eczema and stuff, which is just, such a painful issue for kids.
Mm.
They've gone on multiple steroid creams and things like that. And, things might work for a little bit, but then they don't work long term. And then we connect the dots to mold and we start to reduce their level of exposure and their toxicity. And you see these clients just have these absolute life-changing situations. And, that's why I love it. I absolutely love helping clients to connect those dots to mold, because you do see some massive differences in people once they actually get the data. That's the most important thing, is the
Yeah.
data. You need to know, because I get people ask me, can you come out and do a mold inspection, but we don't want to do any testing, which I say no to now, because there, unless there is like no reason for it, which is very uncommon, you need the data. You need to know what the air quality is like. You need to know what's circulating in your home. You
Mhm.
need to then be able to match those contaminants with what's going on in your body when you're sort of talking to your functional health practitioner. I'm not a functional practitioner, but I do know a hell of a lot after going through this process. And I love guiding my clients in that way. And I love being able to see them genuinely find hope in,
Mm.
where they've been to multiple practitioners and not able to get any resolution. And then they're finally able to connect the dots with mold and see the light, see that
Mhm.
there is hope.
Yeah, for sure. When you say clients ask you to come and do a mold inspection, but they don't want testing, what do they want you to do? Just like moisture mapping?
Have a look.
Okay.
They're like, can you confirm what type of mold this is just by looking at it?
Oh.
Which, look, I can look at something and say, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's mold, but I can't
Yeah.
tell you what type of mold it is. Sometimes
Yeah.
I can have a good idea, but I definitely can't stand up in a court of law and say that is aspergillus or that's stachybotrys.
No.
And without knowing that, you also don't know a lot of the other information. You don't know why the problem is there. You don't know,
Yeah.
if
There's no story.
platysporium, for example, versus say a stachybotrys,
Mm.
you've got two totally different reasons, two totally different root causes for the mold issue. And so you need to know that information and you need to be able to quantify it because yes, mold is everywhere, but is it a little bit of a problem or is it a
Mm.
massive problem?
And do we need to keep looking?
Correct.
Yeah. When it comes to building a house, there is often a tension between cost, aesthetics, and building health. What do you
Yeah.
say to the builder or homeowner who thinks that building a healthy home is going to be too expensive?
Look, it's quite a dangerous and often extremely expensive myth. Builders often assume that because a home is new, it hasn't had the time to develop any of that sort of history or that wear and tear that you might find in an older home. So yeah, it's definitely a dangerous myth to believe. New homes have modern building materials and practices that actually create the perfect conditions for mold in many cases. Drywall, for example, look, I mean, essentially it's fast food for mold. It is made of paper and gypsum, and if it gets wet even just briefly, it can start growing mold, within 24 hours. So it doesn't matter if it's a new home or an old home. Mold doesn't take long to proliferate. 24 to 48 hours in a new home versus an old home doesn't matter, doesn't make a difference. Many new homes are built quite quickly and tightly in terms of like the construction time frame. And quite often, you'll see homes. I know you've seen it, Jess. I've seen some of your Instagram posts, and I've seen it as well, where you see these houses and they're just standing there like halfway through construction in the pouring rain, and then the sun comes out, and very quickly all the walls and everything have gone back up, and those properties haven't been allowed enough time to dry, and therefore the mold can start growing in between the walls before the clients have even had a chance to move into their home. So they've
Mhm.
sort of got this brand new home thinking, amazing, new home, shouldn't have any mold. And then, sort of 6 months down the track, they're really ill or they're seeing mold appear or something's just not quite right. And so I think, the myth that new homes are better than old, yes, you don't have maybe like a long-standing leak potentially or long-standing drainage issues. But when it comes to mold, things can turn very, very quickly. And I think, there's issues where corners are cut. Things just aren't done right. There could be, I've seen issues where the flashing hasn't come out enough on the brickwork. I've seen, what else have I seen? Oh, well, like the pan, the shower pan and things hasn't been done right, or the waterproofing is either not right or not existent at all, which is quite interesting to find. These can happen in any home, whether it's old or new. So I don't think one is better than the other. I think it's just about being diligent in monitoring your home and, doing the things to try and keep it dry.
Yeah, absolutely. You're saying fast food for mold. Nicole Bilsma, who's the owner of the Australian College of Environmental Sciences that we're studying by, she calls it Maccas for mold. She calls
Yeah,
all of the
completely. It's like
all of
so
those.
easy. It's just like the best thing. It just needs a little bit of humidity
Yeah,
and its food source is literally right there. So,
yeah.
yeah, Macca's for mold.
Yeah,
Fast
yeah.
food.
I often just say we're sort of we're building petri dishes, full
Completely.
of moisture sensitive materials. And another thing that I think is much more sort of prolific issue that we're not perhaps aware of is concrete when it's poured, it's not allowed to dry properly, not allowed to cure. I
Mm.
saw a post this week on Instagram, which I'll link in the show notes, for a beautiful home Instagram page that's completely beautiful. Like they show completely beautiful homes. And this home, they found one small crack in their floorboards, and they were just going to replace one floorboard because they thought maybe there was a clip that was broken. They ripped up one floorboard and ended up having to rip up the entire floor because it was
Yeah.
covered under their flooring and under their carpet, covered in black mold, because I am taking a really hot guess that that concrete was still wet when they laid the floors, and they'd put plywood down underneath their
Yep.
flooring. So macas for mold right there.
Yeah.
The underlay of the carpet right there, just covered in black mold, and they had to move out immediately. The house was deemed
Yeah.
uninhabitable like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just spreads. It spreads so fast
Yeah,
in those conditions. So, that's a big expense to both
huge.
the homeowners from a, financial implication, but their health as well. I mean, I saw that post that you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's scary. It's scary for some people to think that it can be just hiding in those places, but that's what we're
Yeah.
looking for, right? That's why you pay a professional mold inspector to try and find the stuff that isn't necessarily visible to the naked eye.
Yeah.
You definitely have to keep going deeper if you can't find the mold, but it's coming up in your samples and things like that. And I have done, a few where I've gone back to a house post inspection and we've got the results back. And we're like, "It doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem right. Let me come back." And I'll go
Mm.
back and I'll sort of work with the client and sort of go through the questions again. Are you sure? Was there anything in this home that was from a water damaged building? And in one instance, in a bedroom that I did, the levels were really, really high. They'd said that there was nothing from a previously water damaged building. Walls were dry, floors were dry, no signs of water damage, nothing in this particular room. Thermal imaging was coming up great. But when they thought back on it, when I came back, they were like, "Oh, actually, that's the one that our mum gave us, that couch that our mum gave us. And I think her home had mold." So it's so funny how, you can look and look and look and look, but until you actually drill right down, that's why it's so important to sort of work with the client in a lot of detail, which might seem a little bit
Mm.
annoying in some ways, but finding out those things is so important because that's having a direct impact. Every time that client sits down on that couch, the mold spores and mycotoxins and things are floating around in the air. So they don't have a moisture issue. They've just got a contaminated piece of furniture.
Yep. Yep. That pre-inspection process and going into the history of the home and the furniture and the area is so intense. And it can be really hard for people who are already feeling a bit foggy from exposure to mold, but it's so important to understand and
Yep.
actually drill down to what really happened.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And that's not the first time I've had, an instance of contaminated furniture where I've gone into a property and the house is actually fine, from a moisture perspective. Yeah, they might
Yeah.
have a bit too much humidity in the home and I had to educate them on that. But in general, the house is completely fine. They've just got contaminated furniture. I've got many people who have said, "Oh, my partner really likes to find furniture on the side of the road and, it's quirky and bring it
Yeah.
home." We don't know where
Yeah.
that's been,
Tricky.
what it's done. You're just literally bringing, I'm all for sustainability, but sometimes it's like
Yeah.
we need to understand what we're bringing into our home. We need to understand what the history of something is. We don't know the bacteria, we don't know the toxins, we don't know the history, the mold, and we could just be exposing ourselves and our family and our home to massive problems.
Yeah, totally. All right, Tracy, it's time for the final question. The final question that I ask all of my guests. If you could summarize in one thing everything that you've learned in your career, what would that be? What's your one piece of advice?
What was it again? Sorry. So that one piece that I've learned in my career.
Yeah. What is one thing out of everything that you've learned in your career that you want the listener to understand?
Mm. Okay. Dust and mold have more of an impact than most people realize. The amount of homes that I go into that have way too much dust and too much humidity within the home, um, that's a simple, simple thing that you can do to try and protect your family and your home from mold. And I think having a look at the level of dust and humidity in the home will actually go a long way to helping people protect themselves from mold.
That's a really hot tip because I've actually got dust on my windowsill just to my right over here, and there's mold growing on it because it's right near my kitchen that's got terrible extraction. Exhibit A.
Yeah, just I mean, it's just one of those things. I think, one of the biggest things is that mold doesn't have to look like the big, black, scary mold you see on the walls. I mean, I've had on my Instagram, I've had, the House of Horrors type of mold situations where it's growing floor to ceiling. Majority of the contaminated homes that I do not have that. It's invisible in most cases. So I think
Mhm.
it's just important to remember it doesn't have to look like the big, ugly, scary mold for it to be causing problems within your home.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you so much
No
for sharing
problem.
all of that knowledge and experience with us. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. See ya.
Bye.